Happy October, everybody! It's the month of Halloween, and what better way to celebrate the season of frights in the night than with a wacky comedy?
I may be fascinated by the horror genre, but when it comes to actually experiencing it, I have a pretty low tolerance. So my favorite movies to watch this time of year are Corpse Bride, the first Harry Potter, and of course Clue, the cult comedy classic. Based on the popular board game, Clue was a box office flop that won a loyal following over time. The film takes the concept of a rich man murdered in his fancy estate by one of his guests by supposing that the guests are all victims of blackmail at the hands of their host. When given the opportunity to off their blackmailer, one of them takes it, and the rest of the film becomes a frantic search for the killer.
We're trying to find out who killed him, and where, and with what.
There are plenty of send-ups to the Parker Brothers game. Each guest is presented with a murder weapon straight from the game. The creative closing credits feature the cast on playing cards, each holding a weapon at that. And there's a really stealthy one near the end. During his famous info dump, Tim Curry drags the guests from room to room as he recounts the events of the evening. It makes for a funny image, but it's also a nice homage to the game, where players must move their pawns into the appropriate room in order to make an accusation. At first glance, it may seem like just a madcap screwball comedy, but look a little deeper and you'll see a lot of effort was put into it. The film is set in 1954, and it takes great pains to be accurate. During the big exposition scene, Mr. Green admits that Mr. Body is blackmailing him for being gay. This is in reference to the Lavender Scare of the 1950s. Homosexuality was thought of as a mental illness, and it was believed that gay government officials were susceptible to blackmail and thus a security risk. Isn't that ironic? But that's not all. In an early scene, the cook is watching the McCarthy Inquiry on TV, which took place in 1954. Wadsworth even mentions the House Un-American Activities Committee, a committee mostly remembered for investigating citizens and organizations suspected of communism. Professor Plum works for the World Health Organization, an agency of the UN, and one character receives a phone call from J. Edgar Hoover, the controversial head of the FBI, who used his position to target subversives and political activists, collected evidence through illegal means, and was suspected of being gay. All this was to give the film a sense of scope and cement its setting. Of course, communism is just a red herring, and it may seem like a lot of extra effort for a movie with such a ridiculous core premise. But little touches like these are appreciated. They're entirely unnecessary, but go a long way in lending the film credibility. For as much as it appears to be a stupid, shallow comedy, it's actually quite smart. In between all the screwball comedy is an actual mystery. It may be hard after the 10 dozen times you've rewatched it, but can you remember how you felt the first time you saw it? Some unusual characters arrive at a creepy old mansion far from civilization, all acting jumpy and suspicious. None of them knows why they've been summoned, and they're just as anxious to find out as we are. Of course, the jokes start right when the movie does, but it takes a while for the really zany stuff to start. Until then, the film really does play out as a murder mystery with some really dark comedy. The characters spend most of the movie searching the house, looking for the murderer. After multiple rewatches, this part of the film can drag, but when you don't know what's coming, it does a good job at balancing comedy with drama. Mixing murder mysteries with wacky comedy is hard to pull off without being tacky, but this film is Exhibit A in how to do it right. It knows what it's doing. For example, there's a truly suspenseful moment when Miss Scarlet investigates the ballroom. For just a moment, she occupies a half-empty two-shot, subconsciously planting the idea in the viewer's psyche that someone should be coming up behind her to fill that empty space. It also knows when to treat death seriously and when the darker jokes can be made. Near the end of the film, the power is cut, causing the characters to stumble around in the darkness while the murderer goes after victims. In the middle of this chaos, the doorbell rings.
Da-da-da-da-da. I am your singing telegram.
It's one of the most well-remembered and darkly funny moments in the movie. But when the characters discover her body, nobody laughs. It's a quiet, sobering moment. In fact, that whole sequence is a good example of how to balance comedy and drama. With the lights out, all these jumpy characters are thrown into a panic, and the murderer has free reign of the house. There are moments of humor.
What's this? Another door?
But they're balanced by moments of suspense. And when the lights finally come on and the guests assess the damage, that same music that was used to create levity in the middle of all the drama cuts out. Everything is quiet and slow. This movie knows what it's doing. It knows exactly what jokes to make and when to be loud and when to be quiet. The timing and pacing is excellent. It's impressive, especially when you consider how difficult it must have been to turn a board game like Clue into a cohesive narrative. Well, maybe cohesive isn't exactly the right word. Clue bombed at the box office, due in part to the gimmick of the multiple endings. The film has 3 alternate endings, in imitation of the way the killer changes every time you play the game. Depending on which theater they attended, moviegoers were shown one of 3 endings. But to make sure all 3 endings were plausible, pieces of evidence were left intentionally vague and even directly contradicted each other. There's no way for a viewer to work out who done it on their own, and this left a bad taste for theater goers. On the DVD release, all 3 endings are presented one after the other, with title cards in between, proclaiming things like, "This is how it could have happened," and "But this is what really happened." It makes for a more satisfying ending and drives the point home that this film is meant to be more comedy than murder mystery. And as a comedy, it holds up quite well. A premise this silly needs every element working together precisely the right way. The cast is filled with comedic geniuses, including the wacky Christopher Lloyd, the incomparable Madeline Kahn, and Tim Curry of Rocky Horror fame and countless voiceover credits. You'd think so many big personalities would crowd each other out, but they complement each other quite well, even when it becomes a contest to see who can chew the scenery the most.
Will you stop that? No.
That's not to say the film is without its faults. It does take a while to warm up, and if you've already seen it, these early expositional scenes can start to drag on. But it's admirable for finding a reason to gather these people in a creepy old mansion and give them ridiculous names. It does a good job at setting up their characters and their backstories, and giving them all believable motives for murder. But none of that is the point of the movie. No, the point of the movie is big comedy that provokes big laughs. It's most famous for a scene near the end where Wadsworth explains how the murders took place, and it's the zaniest, most high-energy scene in the film. This moment so defines how viewers see and remember this movie that it's easy to forget that most of the movie isn't actually like this. It's slow, there are a lot of scenes where people just sit around and talk. Sure, there are jokes throughout, but the pace only really goes crazy at the end. That's not a bad thing, though. Frenetic comedy only works if there are moments of silence to contrast it. And without those moments, Tim Curry Explains It All wouldn't have the punch that it does. The movie is a slow build, gradually picking up momentum before it takes off, literally dragging you along for the ride. And it's an enjoyable ride. This is one you kind of have to turn off your nitpick goggles for, but if you can, it's a rewarding comedic experience. To make a long story short, despite a shallow exterior, this film knows what it's doing. It has a brilliant cast and a great script and takes advantage of every moment of screen time. Every joke lasts just as long as it should, and every actor hits just the right comedic beats. Perhaps a little tedious at points if you know what's coming, but if you're in the mood for a murder mystery that can make you laugh, Clue is definitely worth checking out.
I'm eternally optimistic, and I'll catch you guys next time.